My mom called me on a Tuesday morning while I was standing outside the precinct finishing the last half of a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost did. But something about seeing her name on the screen just times Mom, nothing else. The way I had typed it in when I was 17 and never changed it made me pick up before the second ring. She didn't say hello. She just said, "He filed the papers." I stood there on the sidewalk with the cup halfway to my mouth and the morning traffic moving past me like nothing had changed. Like the whole world hadn't just shifted 2 inches to the left. "When?" I asked. "Friday," she said. "I only found out yesterday." He had them served at the house while I was at Linda's. I asked her if she had read them. She said she had tried. I asked her if she had called anyone. She went quiet in that specific way she had. The silence that meant she had been sitting with something alone for longer than she should have, turning it over in her hands and hoping it would feel different if she just waited a little more. "Mom," I said. "I didn't want to bother you," she told me. "You're busy." I threw the rest of the coffee in the trash can by the door and told her I was coming over after my shift. She told me I didn't have to. I told her I was coming anyway. "My name is Claire. I am 31 years old, and I have been a police officer in Clarksville, Tennessee for 6 years. Before that, I was in the Army for 4, which is where I learned that the most dangerous moments are rarely the ones that announce themselves loudly. It is usually the quiet ones. The paperwork, the small decisions made in back rooms that nobody tells you about until they are already done. My parents had been married for 34 years. My father's name is Gerald. He is 62. Retired from the railroad, and for as long as I can remember, he has operated under the assumption that his version of any story is the only one worth hearing. Not in a dramatic way. Not the kind of man who shouts in restaurants or throws things. The kind who simply speaks with a certainty so total that the people around him eventually stop offering a different perspective because the energy required doesn't seem worth it. My mother had been nodding along to that certainty for 3.5 decades. She had a talent for finding the good in it, for finding the room to breathe inside of it. Her name is Donna. She is 59. She volunteers at the church food pantry on Saturdays. She makes a peach cobbler that my partner Marcus once described as a religious experience, and she has not raised her voice in anger at anyone in my living memory. She is not a weak person. I want to be very clear about that. She is one of the most quietly determined people I have ever known. But she had spent 34 years believing that the way things worked in her marriage was simply the way things worked, and that belief had calcified into something she didn't quite know how to see around anymore. I grew up in that house, understanding the unwritten rules without ever having them explained to me. You did not question Gerald's accounting of things. You did not bring a problem to him unless you also had a proposed solution, because problems without solutions were treated as evidence of weakness, and weakness was something he had no patience for. You expressed gratitude for what was provided. You did not ask about what wasn't. I had moved through my childhood and adolescence inside those rules with the practiced ease of someone who has learned the dimensions of a space by memory, where the low beams were, which floorboards creaked, what to step around without looking. When I joined the Army at 22, I understood for the first time, in the particular clarity that distance provides, what I had been navigating. Not cruelty. Gerald was not a cruel man in the way that word is commonly understood. But there is a kind of authority that doesn't require cruelty that works through certainty and omission, and the slow, consistent pressure of being the person in the room who always already knows. That authority had shaped our household as completely as any architecture, and my mother had lived inside it so long that she had stopped being able to see its edges. What I carried with me from those years was not bitterness. I had worked through most of that in my mid-20s, mostly alone, in the way that people who are trained to be self-sufficient work through things. What I carried was a very precise eye for documentation, for the gap between what a record says and what actually happened, for the specific texture of a story that has been edited by someone who controls the original source material. That eye was what I brought to my mother's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in September. The papers my father had filed were not a surprise to me. Not entirely. I had been watching something shift in him over the past 2 years. A kind of restlessness, a sharpened impatience, an increasing number of evenings where he wasn't where he said he was going to be. My mother had not mentioned any of this to me directly, but mothers and daughters communicate in other ways. The pauses. The subject changes. The way she would ask about my work for a few minutes too long whenever I called, as if she were grateful for something that kept the conversation pointed away from home. What was a surprise was the filing itself, the speed of it, the secrecy, the fact that he had apparently been consulting with an attorney named Douglas Whitfield for several months without her knowledge. I found this out when I sat at her kitchen table that Tuesday evening and read through the documents myself, because my mother had been staring at them for 2 days without being able to take in what they actually said. I am trained to read documents. It is a particular kind of reading, not for pleasure, not for story, but for the exact shape of what is being claimed and what is being omitted. What those papers claimed was that my parents' shared assets were limited, that my father's retirement pension, which he had been receiving for 3 years, was a separate property, that the house, which they had purchased together in 1991, carried a mortgage refinance from 2019 that my mother had apparently signed off on a refinance she described to me when I asked. As paperwork Gerald had put in front of her one evening after dinner and told her was just routine bank stuff, nothing she needed to worry about, she had signed it. I asked her if she knew what she had signed. She looked at the table and told me she had trusted him. I put the papers down and looked at my mother in her own kitchen, in the house where I had grown up, sitting across from me with her hands folded in her lap and an expression on her face that I recognized because I had worn it myself once. A long time ago, the expression of someone who has just begun to understand the full dimensions of a room they have been standing in for years. I told her we were going to get her an attorney. She told me she couldn't afford one. I told her to let me worry about that. My mother's instinct, which was also her great and lifelong limitation, was to be reasonable, to not make things difficult, to find a way for everything to be settled quietly, and without anyone having to raise their voice. She mentioned more than once in those first few days that she didn't want to make Gerald angry. When she said it the 3rd time, I finally asked her why. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Because when he's angry, he stops listening." I said, "Mom, he's already stopped listening." She looked at me, and I saw the moment she heard it, really heard it, and I watched her sit up a little straighter in her chair. I started making calls the next morning. The attorney I found was a woman named Patricia Shea, who ran a small family law practice on Commerce Street with 2 other lawyers and a paralegal named Beto, who seemed to handle most of the actual organization of the office. Patricia was 55, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and had the specific energy of someone who had heard every variation of every story and was still, in spite of this, genuinely interested in hearing yours. She took my mother's case on a reduced fee after I explained the situation. She told my mother in their first meeting that the refinance document was something she wanted to look at very carefully. My mother asked her why. Patricia said, "Because documents that get described as nothing to worry about tend to be the most interesting ones." My father's attorney, Douglas Whitfield, had been practicing family law for 22 years. He was known, Patricia told us, for being methodical and for favoring a strategy of making the opposing party's timeline as exhausting as possible. A lot of filings, a lot of postponements, a lot of requests for documentation that were technically legitimate, but practically overwhelming for someone without resources or stamina. "He's going to try to make this expensive," Patricia said. "And long." My mother nodded. She was taking notes in a small spiral notebook she had brought from home, the same kind she used for grocery lists. I was sitting beside her and I didn't say anything, but I had already started building a different kind of list in my head. The first thing I did was go back to the refinance document. Patricia had flagged it, but I wanted to look at it myself, not as a lawyer, but as someone who understood how paperwork worked, how signatures worked, how the trail of a document could be followed if you knew what to look for. The refinance had been processed through a broker, a company called Landmark Home Services, and the notary signature on the document was a name I didn't recognize. A woman named Sylvia Craddock. I ran the name. Sylvia Craddock was a licensed notary in Montgomery County. She had processed a significant number of documents through Landmark Home Services over the past 4 years. She was also, according to the county records I pulled, the sister-in-law of Gerald's former railroad colleague and longtime friend, a man named Bobby Trent. I sat with that for a day. Then I drove to the county clerk's office on my day off and asked for the notary log for the date of the refinance signing. The woman behind the counter was helpful and brisk. She pulled the records. I looked at the entry for the document in question. My mother's signature was logged as having been notarized at 2:14 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in March of 2019. On that Wednesday, in March of 2019, I knew for a fact that my mother had been in Nashville with her sister Ruth, attending a 2-day quilting retreat. I knew this because I had helped her pack the car the Tuesday evening before. I knew this because she had called me from the hotel that Wednesday morning to tell me she had forgotten her good scissors, and could I check her sewing room. I knew this because I had a photograph on my phone of me standing in her driveway, waving at her car, backing out, with the timestamp in the metadata. I sat in my car outside the county clerk's office for a few minutes before I drove away. I called Patricia Shea that afternoon. I told her what I had found. There was a pause on her end of the line. Then she said, "Claire, I need you to send me everything." I had already anticipated that. Before I called Patricia, I had spent 2 hours at my kitchen table organizing everything into a single folder, printed copies, digital backups, the photograph with the metadata visible, the hotel confirmation I had asked Aunt Ruth to forward to me, her own written statement about the dates of the retreat. I had done it the way I had been trained to build a case file. Chronologically, with every piece of evidence cross-referenced and sourced, nothing loose, nothing that could be challenged on procedural grounds. When I emailed it to Patricia, she called me back within the hour. "This is very organized," she said. "I've had some practice," I told her. I can tell. There was something in her voice that was almost amusement. "Have you ever thought about law school?" I told her I had enough paperwork already. She laughed at that, briefly, and then she got back to business. The weeks that followed had a particular texture. My mother went to her appointments with Patricia and took her notes in her spiral notebook. My father's attorney filed 3 separate motions in the space of 2 weeks, each one requiring a response, each one designed, as Patricia had predicted, to make the process feel like standing in water up to your chest while someone slowly poured in more. My mother came to my apartment for dinner twice a week, and we watched television and didn't talk about it, because sometimes you need a room where the thing isn't allowed to exist for a few hours. I did my work. I showed up for my shifts. I filed my reports. And on my days off I kept pulling threads. The retirement pension was the other piece. My father had taken early retirement from the railroad at 60, and his pension was significant. Considerably more significant than the financial disclosure he had filed with the court suggested. I knew this not because I had access to his accounts, but because my mother, who had managed the household finances for 30 years, had a memory for numbers the way some people have a memory for faces. She could not tell me the exact figure, but she could tell me, very specifically, what their monthly expenses had been and what had been left over, and the arithmetic did not match what Douglas Whitfield was representing to the court. Patricia filed a request for full financial disclosure. Whitfield responded with documents. Patricia looked at the documents and called me. "The pension deposit is going to a different account than the one in this disclosure," she said. "You can prove that?" I asked. "Not yet," she said, "but I know where to look." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in October. My mother wore a gray blazer she had bought for my academy graduation and carried her notebook in her purse. I wore my dress uniform, not because I was required to, not to make a statement. My mother had asked me to, the week before, very quietly. She had said, "I know it's silly, but it makes me feel like someone is on my side." I had told her it wasn't silly at all. The courtroom was smaller than people expect who haven't spent time in them. The walls were a pale, institutional beige. The fluorescent lights were the specific shade of white that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Douglas Whitfield was already seated at the opposing table when we arrived, a man in his mid-50s with the professional patience of someone who had made a career of waiting out other people's discomfort. My father sat beside him in a dark suit and did not look at my mother when we came in. He looked at me. I held his gaze for a moment, and then I looked away, because I had nothing to say to him with my eyes. Everything I had to say was already prepared. The judge's name was Honorable Catherine Marsh. She was in her early 60s, gray-haired, with a manner that was precise without being cold and that communicated, within approximately 45 seconds of the proceedings beginning, that she had a complete absence of patience for anything that wasted her time. The morning session was procedural. Whitfield presented his client's financial disclosure. Patricia raised her objections. The judge reviewed both submissions and asked several pointed questions that Whitfield answered smoothly, and that Patricia answered with a directness that I appreciated. My mother sat beside me with her hands folded in her lap and her notebook on the table in front of her that she didn't open. At one point, my father leaned over and said something to Whitfield in a low voice. Whitfield nodded once. During the lunch recess, Patricia pulled us into a small conference room and laid 3 documents on the table. She walked us through them. My mother asked 2 questions, both of them smart, both of them precise in the way that surprised people who assumed that because she was quiet, she was not paying attention. The afternoon session was when the pension account came up. Whitfield presented the disclosure again. Patricia stood and told the judge that she had reason to believe the disclosure was incomplete and requested permission to enter additional evidence. Whitfield objected. The judge looked at him for a moment, and then looked at Patricia and told her to proceed. Patricia entered the bank correspondence that demonstrated deposits being made into a secondary account that had not appeared in Gerald's financial disclosure. An account in Gerald's name alone, opened 8 months before he filed for divorce, at a credit union in Nashville. The courtroom did not go dramatically silent. That is a television thing. What actually happened was more subtle. A slight shift in the energy of the room, the way air moves differently when something changes. My father's posture changed. Not much. Enough. Whitfield asked for a moment to confer with his client. Judge Marsh said he could have 5 minutes. My father turned to Whitfield, and I watched them have the conversation that people have when the ground has moved under them, and they are trying to decide whether to acknowledge it or pretend they felt nothing. During those 5 minutes, I stood up. I had cleared it with Patricia the day before. She had looked at me for a long moment and then asked me what I was planning to say. I told her. She thought about it. She said, "Make sure you stay procedurally clean." I told her I knew how courtrooms worked. She looked at me again and said, "I know you do. That's not what I meant." I understood what she meant. She meant, "Keep your voice even. Don't make it about you. Make it about the record." I stood up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," I said, "my name is Claire Whitmore. I am the adult daughter of Donna Whitmore, the respondent in this case. I would like to request permission to submit one additional piece of documentary evidence regarding the refinance document filed as Exhibit C." Whitfield was on his feet immediately with an objection. Judge Marsh looked at him and then looked at me. "What is the nature of this evidence?" she asked. I told her. I told her about the notary log. I told her about the timestamp. I told her about the quilting retreat in Nashville. I told her I had a sworn affidavit from my Aunt Ruth, confirming my mother's presence in Nashville on the date in question. I told her I had the original hotel check-in records. I told her I had the metadata timestamp from a photograph taken at my mother's home the morning of her departure. The room was very quiet. I did not look at my father. I kept my eyes on the judge because that was where they belonged. Judge Marsh picked up the exhibit in front of her, the refinance document, and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "how long have you been sitting on this?" "I've been working with my mother's attorney, Your Honor," I said. "The full documentation package was submitted to the court this morning." She looked at Patricia. Patricia confirmed it. Then Judge Marsh looked at the notary log I had provided, and she looked at the refinance document, and she looked at the date, and she looked at the hotel record, and she set everything down on the bench in front of her, and she took off her reading glasses, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the exhale of someone who has just seen something confirm exactly what they suspected, the kind of involuntary sound that comes when a pattern you've been watching finally completes itself. She shook her head once, very slightly. Then she put her glasses back on. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I am going to need your client to explain this discrepancy." Whitfield asked for a continuance. Judge Marsh denied it. My father looked at the table in front of him. He had the expression of a man who has been certain his whole life that the walls he built around himself were solid, and who has just heard one of them crack. He didn't say anything. Whitfield said something carefully neutral about needing time to review the materials. Judge Marsh told him the materials had been submitted to all parties that morning, and she had already reviewed them herself, and she was disinclined to interpret the discrepancy charitably. She turned to Patricia. "Counsel," she said, "what is your client seeking?" Patricia stood and told her. She told her about the pension account, the full value of the marital assets, the house. She told it cleanly and without drama because Patricia was very good at her job. The judge made several notes. Then she said, "I'm going to recess for 20 minutes, and when we return, I want a straight answer from the petitioner's side about this account and this notarization, or I am going to draw my own conclusions and proceed accordingly." She stood. We stood. My mother reached over and put her hand on top of mine. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We didn't need to. During the recess, I went to the water fountain in the hallway and stood there for a moment. My father came out of the courtroom a few minutes later. He walked toward me and I straightened up and waited. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at me with an expression that I recognized, not anger, not quite, but the close relative of anger, the one that wears the face of injury. "You could have come to me," he said, "if you had questions." I looked at him. I thought about all the things I could say. I thought about the Tuesday evenings of my childhood spent at that kitchen table doing homework, while he explained to my mother why her understanding of the household budget was incorrect. I thought about the times she had tried to tell him something wasn't sitting right with her, and he had redirected the conversation so smoothly that by the end of it she was thanking him for clarifying. I thought about the specific weight of growing up in a house where one person's version of reality was always the authoritative one. I did not say any of those things. I said, "I went where the records were, Dad." He stood there for a moment. Then he turned and went back into the courtroom. I finished my water and followed. The afternoon session lasted another 2 hours. Whitfield attempted 3 separate reframings of the pension account situation. The judge responded to each one with a specific question that dismantled it efficiently. My father was asked directly, on the record, to explain the date discrepancy on the notarization. His explanation, which amounted to a claim that there might have been an administrative error by the notary, was received by Judge Marsh with the particular stillness of someone choosing not to say what they are thinking. She recessed again at 4:15 and told us she would have a ruling by end of week. Patricia drove my mother home. I drove myself. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for a few minutes with the engine off before I turned the key, watching the afternoon light come down flat and gold across the parking structure, one of those October lights that makes everything look like it's been cleaned. My phone rang. It was my Aunt Ruth calling to ask how it went. I told her we'd have to wait for the ruling. She said, "But how did it go?" I said, "I think okay." "I think it went okay." She exhaled. I heard her say something to someone in the background, probably my cousin Meg, who had driven Ruth to the church that morning to say a prayer about it because that was what Ruth did with things that mattered. "Your mama doing all right?" Ruth asked. "She's holding up," I said. "She's stronger than she lets on." "Always has been," Ruth said. "You two are more alike than you know." I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at my kitchen table and ate it and didn't turn on the television. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets when something has been pressing on the air for a long time and then lifts a little. The ruling came on a Friday. Patricia called my mother first and then called me. Judge Marsh had found that the notarization on the refinance document was procedurally invalid due to the clear impossibility of the recorded date, and had ordered the document set aside. She had found that my father's financial disclosure had materially misrepresented the marital assets by omitting the secondary pension account. She had ordered a full forensic accounting of both parties' finances over the preceding 4 years. She had made an interim order preserving the marital home and prohibiting any transfer of assets pending the accounting. She had also referred the matter of the notarization to the county district attorney's office for review. I was sitting on my couch when Patricia told me this last part. The notary? I said. And potentially others, Patricia said. That's up to the DA's office. But yes. I sat with that for a moment. How's my mom taking it? I asked. She cried a little, Patricia said. Then she asked me if she should bring something to Beto's next appointment because she heard it was his birthday. I smiled at that. I couldn't help it. I called my mother. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding the phone waiting. I heard, I said. Patricia told you? Just now. There was a pause. Then my mother said, I keep thinking about that Tuesday morning when you picked up the phone. I almost didn't call. I said, I almost didn't pick up. She laughed a little at that, a quiet laugh, the kind that holds things in it. I'm glad you did, she said. Me too, I said. Outside my window, the neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do on a Friday afternoon in late October. Kids coming home from school, someone mowing a lawn that didn't really need it, the sound of a dog barking at something that probably wasn't there. Ordinary sounds. The sounds that are there all the time and that you only really hear when something inside you goes still enough to let them in. My mother asked me if I wanted to come for dinner Sunday. I said I would bring the rolls. She said Gerald used to always forget to bring the rolls, and then she stopped herself in the middle of saying it and I heard her recognize what she had just said used to. Past tense. The small natural way that time was already sorting itself. Sorry, she said. Don't be, I said. It's fine. It's a lot to get used to, she said. I know, I said. You've got time. We stayed on the phone a little while longer without saying much. The way you do with someone when the talking is mostly finished, but the connection is the thing. The sun was coming through my window at an angle that was warm without being harsh. That particular late afternoon light that doesn't ask anything of you. Eventually, she said she should start dinner. I told her I'd see her Sunday. She said, wear something comfortable. Not your uniform. I laughed. I told her I would. I set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of my apartment, and I thought about what it means to stand up in a room when everything in your training and your upbringing and the long habit of keeping peace tells you to stay seated. I thought about documents, about dates, about the way truth has a shape that doesn't change, no matter how many other things are stacked on top of it. I thought about my mother sitting at her kitchen table with her hands folded, and the moment she sat up straighter in her chair, that was when I knew. Not in the courtroom. Not when the judge set aside the document or ordered the accounting or referred the matter to the DA. Before all of that, at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in September, when my mother looked at me and heard a thing she already knew, and decided quietly, in the way she decided everything, that this time she was not going to look away from it. The case would continue for several more months. The forensic accounting would take time. There would be more filings, and more appearances, and more of Whitfield's strategic patience. Though it carried somewhat less weight than it had before. The DA's office would eventually open a formal inquiry into the notarization, which would lead to a conversation with Sylvia Craddock, which would lead to a conversation with Bobby Trent, which would lead to conversations I was not privy to, but that Patricia kept me generally informed about in the careful way attorneys do when they don't want to get ahead of themselves. My mother moved through all of it the way she moved through difficult things, by continuing to function, by showing up for her Saturday food pantry shifts, by bringing Beto a lemon pound cake on his actual birthday, by calling me on Tuesday mornings. I always picked up. One evening in November she called me, and I could tell from her voice that something had shifted. Not badly, but significantly. I asked her what was going on. She said, I was going through some things in the guest room. Old boxes. And I found a picture of me from before I got married. I was 22. I was standing outside the house I grew up in, and I had this look on my face. She paused. What kind of look? I asked. Like I was deciding something, she said. Like I knew something was coming and I was ready for it. I didn't say anything, because sometimes you don't need to. I forgot, she said quietly. I forgot that I looked like that once. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. I thought about who my mother had been at 22, before the long project of accommodating someone else's certainty had done its slow work on her. I thought about the things that accumulate in a person without their full noticing the adjustments, the silences, the paperwork you sign because you have been told it is nothing to worry about, The forensic accountant's report came back in February. It confirmed what Patricia had suspected: the secondary pension account had been receiving deposits for nearly 3 years, consistently, in amounts that added up to something substantial. The account had never appeared on any joint statement. My mother had not known it existed. When Patricia called to tell us the figures, my mother was sitting at my kitchen table. I had put her on speaker. She listened to the numbers without speaking. When Patricia finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That would have paid for Ruth's medical bills, twice over." She wasn't saying it to anyone in particular, just placing it somewhere, setting it down where it could be seen clearly. After Patricia hung up, I made tea, and we sat at the table together, and I let my mother have whatever she needed to have with that information. She cried for a little while, not dramatically, in the specific way of someone releasing something they have been holding in a very controlled grip. I put my hand over hers and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. After a while, she straightened up and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked out the window at my small backyard, where the February light was doing what February light does, thin and honest and without any softness too. "Spare. What happens now?" she asked. "Now Patricia goes back to court with the full accounting," I said. "And the judge makes a final ruling on the asset division." My mother nodded. She had her notebook open in front of her. She wrote something in it. I asked her what she wrote. She turned the notebook so I could see. She had written 2 words. "This counts." I looked at her. "I used to write that in my journals," she said. "When something happened that I wanted to make sure I didn't minimize later, when something was real and I didn't want to let myself explain it away." She paused. "I stopped doing it for a long time." "Why?" I asked. She thought about it. "Because it started to feel like too many things counted, and I didn't know what to do with all of them." We sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and picked up her tea and said, "What are you making for dinner?" I told her I had chicken in the fridge. She said she would make the rice if I did the chicken. We made dinner together in my small kitchen, the way we had made it 100 times before in her kitchen when I was growing up. Her at the stove, me at the counter, the radio on low, neither of us needing to fill the space with more than what was already there. The winter light went down outside the window. The apartment got warm from the cooking, and I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this was what the whole thing had been about. Not the documents, not the courtroom, not even the ruling when it came. It was about this, my mother, in my kitchen, making rice, writing things down in her notebook, deciding that things counted again. The final hearing took place in March. The forensic accounting stood. The secondary account was included in the marital estate. The house was awarded to my mother, free of the invalidated refinance lien. The pension was divided according to the 34 years of the marriage. Judge Marsh's ruling was 22 pages, and I read every word of it. Patricia called it a good outcome. She said it with the professional composure of someone who has learned not to attach too much emotion to results, but I heard something else underneath it, the particular satisfaction of a person who has done their job and done it right. My mother called me that evening and told me she had gone to the food pantry that afternoon, after the hearing, because it was Saturday, and that was what she did on Saturdays. I told her that was exactly right. She said, "The judge had kind eyes." I thought about Judge Marsh, the way she had set down her reading glasses, the sound she had made when she looked at the date on the notary log, the careful precision of her 22-page ruling. "Yeah," I said, "she did." And then I said, "She also had a very good eye for a document that didn't add up." My mother laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard from her in a long time. I sent the photograph in the mail a few weeks later, tucked inside a card. No message in the card. Just her name at the bottom. The way she signed things that she wanted to last. I put it on my refrigerator. Every morning when I leave for work, I walk past it. A woman of 22 standing outside a house in the sun, with the particular expression of someone who knows something is coming and is not afraid of it. I see my mother in it every time. And some mornings, if the light is right, I see myself